What's up, everybody? Welcome to another primary source walkthrough. This time we have Frank H. Hill on the Indian New Deal from 1935. I don't really have a joke for you to open this one up. I've done a bunch of videos in a row, so I think my ridiculousness is starting to get a little bit tired. So let's make this one a little bit shorter, and we'll just get right to it. So again, we've been talking about the New Deal and its effect on the United States, and one of the things that I really want you to think about is what did the New Deal do for Americans of all kinds of different backgrounds? We have spent a considerable amount of time, two primary sources, talking about the New Deal and the effect on African Americans. We've also spent kind of ruminating on the definition of liberty and how the New Deal changes fundamentally what it means to be to believe in America, those sorts of things. Well, we should take stock of what's been happening with Native Americans too, because obviously the New Deal is going to affect them. And the New Deal, in some of what it's doing, it's taking on some federal lands, and it's modifying certain territory. It's doing all kinds of different stuff. And so obviously that's going to have an effect on Native Americans. And there had been some pretty significant court cases about the status of Native Americans in recent decades, and kind of a walking back of the there's no other way to put it, genocidal policies of the 19th century that we saw with Wounded Knee, the Sand Creek Massacre, and other stuff. I mean, think back to what you read from the Wounded Knee editorials and some of the other documents that we read earlier on in the course. It's not to say things got hugely better, but the New Deal does do some things, and even before the New Deal, policy had started to change. So, one of the things that the New Deal does is it ends, as the introduction points out, forced assimilation and allows Indians unprecedented cultural autonomy. So basically, what it's saying is that what the New Deal does is it ends forcing Native Americans into a position where they have to conform to American culture or else. And the way that this had been done, I think you got a sense of this if you read an Indigenous Peoples History of the U.S., what the government was doing was it was kidnapping Native American youth and forcing them into quote-unquote rehabilitation schools. Basically, these boarding schools that were trying to erase the cultural heritage of Native Americans and make them into proper, quote-unquote, proper Americans. Now, as the introduction points out, the New Deal seems to be a net positive, but it's not completely all roses here. So, for example, the Navajo are going to protest against some of these conservation programs to no avail. Like the Navajo say, well, that's our land. We should be, if you're giving us our autonomy, then we should be able to say what happens on our land. And the federal government is like, no, that's ours. We'll do with it as we want. So, this is not a complete recognition of tribal autonomy. So let's jump in here. So, what Hill is doing is he's kind of like setting up a brief history of the federal government's dealings with Native Americans, and he points to something that happened in 1934, this Wheeler-Howard Act, that gives the tribes the right to decide whether they would accept important privileges in education, self-determination, and self-government. And he's saying like this is pretty good. He's noting that John Collier, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, has been a powerful leader in this regard. And the things seem to be doing a little bit better than they were. Now, what had happened in the past, the government tried to encourage economic independence and initiative by the allotment system, giving each Indian a portion of land and the right to dispose of it. As a result, the 138 million acres which Indians possessed in 1887, they have lost all but 47 million acres, and the lost area includes the land that was the most valuable. Further, the government sought to give the Indian the schooling of the whites, teaching him to despise his old customs and habits as barbaric. That's the boarding schools. Through this experiment, the Indian lost much of his understanding of his own culture and received no usable substitute. In many areas, such efforts to change the Indian have broken him economically and spiritually. So now, what he is getting at in his saying about the New Deal is that we have learned that we are going to respect the Indian as he is. That we have to accept that before we can assist him in becoming something else, if that's what he wants. He's trying to return some cultural autonomy. He's also getting down out here is that, there's no one Indian. There are all kinds of tribes. And in 1934, he's taking note that there are 230 tribes. They're across 22 different states. They speak dozens of different languages. So there's no one policy that really can be adopted towards, what, if we're trying to come up, from the white man's perspective, an answer to the Indian question, there's no one answer. But we have to take stock of this diversity. He goes on and he says, look what's happening. Things are going really well for natives now. Our new policy has already started a renaissance in Indian arts. Young Indians are painting murals on the walls of schoolhouses and government buildings. They're studying their old rites. They're studying ancient pottery. And he's saying, look, natives can use white technologies and remain true to their identities. That modernity and white Americanism are not identical. You don't have to be a white American to be modern. That there is an Indian modernity too that they can define for themselves. Now, the question is, this seems like all pie in the sky sorts of stuff, right? Like, is this really what's happening on the ground? And that's where you need to take the next step. And if you want to know what's happening on the ground, this is why you need to read the context closely. And, how much the textbook is able to give us is limited. Because that's not the purpose of this textbook. Or the purpose that this textbook has given itself. So if you're curious about how this plays out on the ground, then that's where you need to read histories that are more geared towards understanding Native Americans. That's why I had you read something from an indigenous people's history of the United States. That's why I have you read other stuff about Native Americans, because, we have to question, Does Frank H. Hill actually describe reality here? Or is he just talking up the New Deal to talk up the New Deal? Or is it somewhere in between? Or is there a perspective that we haven't even considered? That's the goal of historical research. So, part of the moral of the story here is don't take primary sources at face value. That's why we have to dig in and analyze. Remember, everybody's biased, including people who write primary sources. They're just telling you their perspective on the world. So keep that in mind with this source. All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up there. Keep on keeping on. We'll be back next week for World War II and some crackers of some primary sources. We're going to have to dig deep next week. It's important that we do. So until next time, ladies and gentlemen, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next one. Be good.